Hello, I'm Anthony. I was listening to an album a couple of days ago and noticed the number of plays were just absolutely ridiculously small. It's one of my favourite albums of all time, and the number in the plays list just didn't make any sense to me. And by the way, it's not Beatles Revolver, that's just hiding spoilers. And so I thought I'd make a video today listing 5 albums that I think should be far more popular than they currently are. And we're going to make a little bit of a game of it, because I'd be pretty impressed if you've listened to all of these 5 albums. So you're going to get a point if you've heard of the band or artist, and another point if you've actually heard the album. If you score 10 points, please put it in the comments below. I would love to know that there is a kindred spirit out there who loves all of this music that I'm going to talk about today. The album as a musical concept is hugely important to me. I made a video fairly recently about it. I'll put a link to it above and in the description, where I talk about the album as an art form and how important it is that we maintain this perspective of listening to music. It's far more important than the individual single serving chunks that we seem to be being fed these days. Anyway, without further ado, onto the list. Here's number 1, Erpland by Ozric Tentacles. This album is probably in my top 20. I don't actually have an official top 20, but I would imagine it's in there. It's just an unbelievable piece of music. No single track on this album has more than 1 million plays, which I consider to be the absolute low bar of acceptability on Spotify. If a piece of music that I love this much doesn't have 1 million plays, something is seriously askew with the world. Now, Ozric Tentacles have a very soft spot in my heart because when I was at university in Liverpool, during that time, a good friend of mine had seen Ozric's perform at Glastonbury and was extolling their virtues, but basically it was impossible to buy any of their music. They were on very limited production runs. In fact, their first few albums were released only on cassette. I actually owned a couple of the original cassette albums by Ozric's and tragically got rid of them at some point in my past. I don't know why. But I remember browsing a music shop in Liverpool called Probe Records, one of my favourite haunts at lunchtimes during a university day, and came across Erpland on CD, hung up on the wall actually. I took this thing down off the wall, snap bought it, just on the recommendation of this friend. I'd never heard any of their music. Got this thing home and within 5 seconds knew that I was going to be in love with Ozric's for the rest of my life. It was one of those revelatory experiences. In fact, there's no other musician or band, artist, whatever, that I've ever so instantly fallen in love with. The first few seconds of Eternal Wheel off Erpland completely transformed my musical perspective in a way that no other music ever has. The funny thing about Ozric's is that they've spent basically 40 years writing the same album over and over again, and I absolutely love every one of them. It's the most extraordinary thing. They do a very narrow thing, but they do it in a completely unique way, and they don't sound like anyone else. If I have an Ozric itch to scratch, I basically need to listen to them, and there's nowhere else to go. I was a computer programmer for trade for many years, and Ozric's was my go-to background music. Ozric's and Jean-Michel Jarre were the 2 bands I could have on in the background, predominantly because they had no lyrics, but secondly because it just puts me in a beautifully calm and peaceful state of mind. I can listen to this music effectively indefinitely, and Erpland is my favourite of all of the Ozric Tentacles albums. I don't know whether or not it's because it's the first one I heard and it had such a huge emotional impact on me, but it is amazing. Check it out. Now, of the 5 albums I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to select 1 track off each album and make a little playlist. I'll put the Spotify playlist in the description below. So if you just want to hear a sampling of each of these albums, I'll handpick the kind of the go-to track off each of the albums. In this particular case, it is track number 1, Eternal Wheel. It's my favourite track on the album. I remember every single characteristic and feature of the room and the state of being I was in when I first heard this album. It is an absolutely imprinted memory from 34 years ago. Okay, 1 point if you've ever heard of Ian Carr's Nucleus, and another point if you've ever heard Alley Cat by this band. Nucleus is a fusion jazz band that released a series of amazing albums throughout the 1970s. I could have picked 3 or 4 different albums. I chose Alley Cat because the first track on this album, Fido Corner, is one of my favourite pieces of music by Nucleus. So again, that's going to be the pick for my best of list. But I do urge you to check out the entire album. And they approach jazz in a way that resonates far more deeply with me than many other forms, because it's funky as hell and really musical. They never seem to forget that they're serving the music. A lot of the problems that I have with jazz music, and I love a lot of jazz music, but there's a lot of it that falls by the wayside for me because it becomes more a matter of technical virtuosity than serving the music. I'm not interested in how technically impressive a musician is. Never have, never will be. I only want to hear the music and be moved by it emotionally. And that's something that Nucleus do very often, as far as I'm concerned. Alley Cat also has an awesomely cool album cover. I wish I had this one hanging on my wall. It is fantastic, but it's a little bit pricey to get hold of a copy of this these days. So I'll just have to satisfy myself by looking at the album cover on Spotify. Number 3, and you've got 2 alternative ways to get one of the points here, because you can say either David Sylvian or Robert Fripp, but the album is called Damage. This is a live album released in 1994 from a collaboration tour that these 2 musicians performed together. And this live album is culled from their last 2 performances. It's absolutely majestic. Look at these play numbers. What's going on? What is going on with the world? Only one track gets into 6 figures. This doesn't make any sense to me at all. This album is an absolute masterpiece. There are actually tracks on this album that don't appear on any studio album, so it's an important part of the body of work by David Sylvian and Robert Fripp. They did a collaboration for a couple of years together, but this is absolutely the highlight. It's very reminiscent, actually, in many ways, of another one of my favourite bands, King Crimson. In fact, Trey Gunn and Pat Mastelotto on bass and drums respectively both appear on this album, and Trey Gunn's bass playing is just absolutely to die for. Really, really musical, very beautiful. Now, if you've never heard David Sylvian's voice before, it might take you a little while to grow accustomed to it. It's very idiosyncratic, and when I first heard it, I must confess I wasn't that big a fan. This is going way back to the 80s when he was in a band called Japan. As the years have gone on, he's actually lent into his idiosyncrasy. He has a very intense vibrato in his voice. It becomes absolutely intoxicating, and when you want to hear the David Sylvian warble, then nothing else will quite touch the spot. Layer that over the top of Robert Fripp's guitar acrobatics, and you've got something that's just absolutely unbelievable. Now, my pick for the playlist off this album is actually once again track number 1. It's just a coincidence. Not all track number 1s are always the best songs on an album or pieces of music, but God's Monkey is fantastic, so I've chosen that to go on my playlist. But please listen to the entire album. It is an absolute tour de force, and you really lose yourself in this kind of ethereal, when Robert Fripp really gets going, and he's got these beautiful layered guitar lines kind of soaring off into the heavens, and over the top of it, David Sylvian's ethereal vocals. It's really a magical combination. My 4th pick has a familial relationship with Robert Fripp. This is Adrien Bellu. They performed together for a period in King Crimson. And I think of all of the albums in my list of amazing things that need to be heard, this is probably the lowest number of plays. This is just, once again, inexplicable. Side 2 by Adrien Bellu is part of a trilogy of albums that he recorded at home, where he performed all of the instrumentation himself. I think Side 2 from 2005 is my pick of the 3. They are all outstanding, and they do work really well as a trilogy. I'd like to have a triptych of the 3 album covers on my wall, actually, because they're kind of beautiful in their own harrowing way. This album cover is actually a painting by Adrien Bellu himself. My pick off this album is track number 4, Asleep. I think Adrien Bellu has one of the most underrated voices in modern music. It's really, really characterful and rich and beautiful. I've mentioned the word actually already in this video, but I really like idiosyncratic musicians, people who have an unusual perspective on life. And there are few people that you can say that more about than Adrien Bellu. He is a genuine one of, but the music on this album is outstanding. Please go and give it a listen. Now, I might be throwing away some game points with this 5th choice because, as you can see, a couple of the pieces on this album have been heard more than any others. This is Strange Cargo 3 by William Orbit. At this point in his career, this is from 1993, William Orbit was an electronic musician and producer. And Strange Cargo 3 is another one of those life moments where the first time I heard this album was the first time I truly appreciated what great production meant. I'd obviously heard albums with great production at this point. I was 23 years old. I had a reasonable album collection behind me at this point, but never before had I listened to an album that painted such vivid shapes and pictures in my mind with its production. I could hear the meticulous placement of all of the noises that I was hearing. There was actually a break in my voice there. I was thinking about it because this stuff makes me emotional. It's just an amazing piece of production. This album was kind of a springboard for William Orbit as well because it was so outstanding. People started to notice who he was. In 97 and 98, he collaborated with Madonna, first on the Ray of Light album, and then he co-wrote A Beautiful Stranger, which appeared on an Austin Powers film. This, for me, is William Orbit at the height of his powers. I'm going to pick A Touch of the Night. I could have picked Water from a Vine Leaf. That's his most famous song, and it was actually a single at the time. But A Touch of the Night, I think, is the best song on the album. Another quick mention about this album, actually. The last 15 or 20 minutes is my favourite kind of extended section of the album. And ironically, all of these tracks have the fewest number of plays. So it appears that I am directly in conflict with the rest of the world when they come to their opinion about what you should be listening to. Touch of the Night and the end of the album is the least popular music on this album, and it's all my favourite stuff. We end up in a very kind of mood-ridden, transcendent place, which is just absolutely glorious. Meditation music, I suppose you could call it. So those are my 5 picks for albums that you probably haven't heard of, but you absolutely should. Let me know in the comments below how many points you scored. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.